we ready?
Yeah, let's do it. We're here today with Andrew Adonis, Lord Andrew Adonis. Is that how you want to?
Yeah, that's fine.
Talk about the elephant in the room. We've got an election going on. What do you think the outcome of the election is going to be, and how much is Brexit going to have an impact on that?
Well, predicting elections is a mug's game, and opinion polls always seem to get elections wrong. What do I want to see happen? I want to see Brexit stopped, and I want to see Boris Johnson lose. And I think he's got a very tough job anyway, because he's got to get 325 seats, half the seats in the House of Commons, to get a majority. And at the moment, even though he's ahead in the polls at the moment, it's still near certain that he's going to lose a lot of seats to the Scottish National Party in Scotland, to the Liberal Democrats in England. There are a lot of marginal seats between Labour and Conservative, and it's hard to see him winning many Labour seats. And there are quite a few Conservative seats which are highly competitive on the part of the Labour Party. So it's everything to play for at the moment, and I think there's a good chance we can stop Brexit.
And how much is Brexit going to have an impact on the outcome of the actual election itself?
So I'm not sure. It clearly is the single biggest issue in the election, but elections are never just about one issue. And it's been very striking that we've had nearly a week of campaigning so far. And the biggest issue in that week with the public has been the future of the NHS. And even Brexit has come to be debated so far through the prism of the NHS because of the controversy as to whether or not Brexit would lead to the UK healthcare market, the NHS, actually being opened to Donald Trump and American competition. So it's certainly not going to be a one-issue election. Probably Brexit will be the biggest issue. Maybe not in the campaign, but certainly the fate of Brexit is the biggest thing that will be decided by the election, because the election will basically decide whether Brexit happens or not. So it's the single biggest issue which will be decided by the election, even if it's not actually the biggest issue in the campaign.
And Michael Gove, I'm not sure you saw, but Michael Gove was recently very active on Twitter these past couple of days, mentioning anti-Semitism towards the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn. What do you think about politicians using religion as a political tool? Because we see Labour members criticising the Conservatives about Islamophobia, and vice versa with the Conservatives criticising Labour about anti-Semitism.
Well, I'm strongly opposed to anti-Semitism, and there has been clearly an issue with anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, though it's being dealt with at the moment. And I don't think it's an issue in this election campaign, because it is being dealt with. And I think, to be frank, the reason why Michael Gove was trying to raise it was to divert from the issues which really are at the heart of this election campaign, which of course are Brexit, the NHS, the public services, and the whole future of the country.
You were at the People's Vote launch, and we know what the People's Vote is, to essentially prevent Brexit, not prevent Brexit, but to have a vote on the whole idea. Do you think the people in the electorates in this election are going to come round to that idea, even the Leave voting constituencies?
Well, some will and some won't. The question is, where does the majority lie? And if the majority doesn't lie with Boris Johnson at the end of this election, but instead lies with all the current opposition parties, then there will be a referendum, probably next spring, and then people will get to vote on whether they want to stay in the EU or not, because all of the opposition parties, Labour, Lib Dem, Welsh Nationalist, Scottish Nationalist, the lot, Green, they're all in favour of a referendum with an option to remain in the EU. So unless Boris Johnson gets a majority, all of the opposition parties will come together and there will be a referendum.
And in regards to Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party, so Nigel Farage has recently decided not to stand as a candidate. How much do you think how much impact is that going to have on the Brexit Party? And where do you think the Brexit Party are in terms of influencing electorates of their manifesto?
Well, it looks as if there are going to be 600 Brexit candidates across the country, and that will clearly take votes away from the Conservatives. So I think actually that helps Labour, the Lib Dems and the Nationalist parties. I don't think it makes much difference whether Farage himself is a candidate. I mean, he's been a candidate 7 times in elections before and has always lost.
Mainly the European, he's an MEP.
Well, he's been 7 times a candidate for Westminster. Right. He's also been a candidate for the European Parliament, where he's won. But under first past the post, the electoral system for Westminster, it's almost impossible for Nigel Farage to win a seat. And I'm not sure whether that's the reason why he's not standing, or whether it's because he doesn't have so much commitment in this election as he's had in previous elections. But either way, the Brexit party is still going to be quite a considerable force in this election if they do stand 600 candidates.
What we are faced with is constant doublespeak, which misleads the British people and debases the quality of public debate. Now, my lords, I'm afraid that this doublespeak goes to the heart of the character of the Prime Minister himself. He believes, he tells us, in having customs checks, but simultaneously in having no customs checks. He says he will comply with the law, but he has no intention of doing what it says. He uses vile, crass, inflammatory language while claiming to be a model of restraint. My lords, he is unfit to hold office, and the sooner he goes, the better.
Yeah. Very good speech. Well done.
Moving away from the election and Brexit, you were the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Education under Blair and Brown, mainly under Brett Blair, and you were the pioneer of the tuition fees. But later down the years, you've actually criticised the policy and completely went against the policy. What would you have done different? What would you do differently if you were?
Well, what I criticised was the trebling of the tuition fees. It's very important to understand what happened. Labour in 2004 introduced tuition fees of £3,000 a year as part of a broader deal to increase student numbers, so more people, particularly from less advantaged backgrounds, could go to university who hadn't been able to go previously because there was a cap on student numbers. What the Conservatives did as part of their austerity measures in 2010 was to treble tuition fees from £3,000 to £9,000, and I was strongly opposed to that. I thought the right thing to do was for the fees to stay at £3,000, all paid for after graduation through the tax system, so that this was a fair balance between the general taxpayer, who still continued to subsidise universities very heavily, and the individual gaining from having a degree. I didn't think then or now that it was right to treble the tuition fees, and that's why I became a critic of the policy. If we'd stuck with the original policy of modest tuition fees, then I think that it would have been sustainable. But to treble the tuition fees so that people are leaving university with debts of £50,000 to £60,000 a year, £60,000, which is what's now happening, and £9,000 a year, I think is too much.
And recently, well, today actually, Jacob Rees-Mogg talked on the issue of Grenfell, and he said that we should blame the residents because they chose to listen to the instructions of the London Fire Brigade, and Jacob Rees-Mogg is under heavy criticism recently because of his speech against the Ben Act, and I'm not sure you saw him lying down in Parliament during that whole speech.
Everyone's seen him doing that.
It's a meme,
actually. Everywhere, isn't it?
But I just wanted to ask, how much damage do you think Jacob Rees-Mogg has done to the Conservative Party's campaign?
I don't know is the answer. It's certainly wrong what he's done. It was wrong to treat the House of Commons with contempt by treating it like a kind of sofa, and it's clearly monstrous, really, to blame the Grenfell victims for what happened to them, which clearly wasn't their fault at all. Indeed, it was much more the fault of the public authorities that hadn't removed the flammable cladding. There weren't sprinkler systems in Grenfell, which was all part and parcel of austerity. So if the public authorities were to blame, then that of course has far more to do with Jacob Rees-Mogg than as a member of the government than anyone else. So I think they were very misplaced, those comments. Will they rebound against the Conservatives? I think they'll be part of a general picture that Conservatives don't care. They're behind austerity, they're distant, and this in particular, this group of Etonian Conservatives, which of course includes Boris Johnson himself, I think are seen as being even more distant, and I don't think people want to see Tories like Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson running the show for much longer.
Yeah. Going back to the whole debate about Brexit, Michael Gove has recently come out and said that if the Conservative Party do gain a majority, a no deal is potentially back on the table. What do you think the Conservative Party can do to actually convince the constituents, especially within Remain voting constituents, because even some Remainers, they're completely against the idea of a second referendum because they say that the first referendum should be finalised and that we should potentially leave the EU with or without a deal. How do you think the Conservative Party is able to convince the majority of electorates of their manifesto, whether it be a deal or no deal?
Well, there aren't many Remainers who think that a referendum is a bad idea. The overwhelming majority of Remainers want a second referendum and want the opportunity to stop Brexit. So I think it's very difficult for the Conservatives to persuade a majority. But under our electoral system, of course, you don't need a majority of the voters to win. I mean, parties that win elections in Britain tend to have between 35 and 45% of the vote, and it's tended to be towards that lower figure. And indeed, one of the big concerns I've got about Brexit at the moment is you could get the Conservatives winning an election with conceivably less than 40% of the vote, particularly if Labour and the Liberal Democrats are fairly even. So less than 40% of the vote, but then that still gives them a majority in Parliament for Brexit. Now, last time it was a narrow referendum result. It would be a tragedy for the country if we're forced out of the European Union by a minority of voters who, because of our electoral system, have a parliamentary majority.
I was actually having a conversation with someone, Europeans, people who are afraid of losing their position within this country because of the referendum, because of the outcome of the referendum. And I was also having a conversation with, British citizens as well. And a lot of British citizens are under the opinion that if we don't leave the EU, so in terms of economically, it would have a negative effect if we do leave the EU. But they said that if we don't leave the EU, it's going to impact the country socially and culturally. What is your response to that?
We mean that it will impact the country negatively.
Yeah, in terms of like socially and culturally, and people being disenfranchised with the whole idea of the political system.
Well, if we don't leave.
If we don't leave.
Well, I am very clear that we should only stay in the European Union if that's the will of a majority in a second referendum, and that deals with the issue of consent and the cultural issues. Clearly there's going to be a group of people who are disappointed whether we leave or don't leave. The crucial thing is that we do it democratically, and I'm certainly not proposing that we should leave without a further democratic process. We've got an election going on at the moment. As I say, I think it's quite possible that we'll get a referendum afterwards, and that's the process by which we vote to stay.
It's been very, very clear to me, my lords, if we're going to deal with this massive crisis that we face as a country, we have got to do two things. We have got to end austerity and fundamentally invest in our local communities, particularly poorer communities, and at the same time, we should stop Brexit, and we need to do the two together.
And lastly, moving away from Brexit and elections, I read in The Guardian that you had a near-death experience whilst walking on a highway with Boris Johnson.
Riding on the bike?
No,
it was on a bike. It was on a bike. It wasn't walking.
Yeah.
Now what happened is we were on a bike on one of his cycle superhighways. I was transport secretary and he was mayor of London. And as we were passing a van, the doors was flung open at the back, and we had to veer out, and we narrowly missed the door. And then there was an oncoming truck, which we also narrowly missed, and both of us ended up on the road. Near death. I don't know.
Is that an exaggeration?
I think. You do questions. You never know what's near death. You don't know what would have happened. Yeah. It was certainly dramatic, and actually, what it brought home is, which is part of the argument for the superhighways. We weren't actually on a road with the superhighway at the time. Is the importance of having segregated facilities for cycling, and those, I'm a very strong critic of Boris Johnson in many respects. I think the segregated cycle facilities that he introduced were correct. There's been a doubling in cycling in London over the last 10 years, and part of the reason for that is we've improved facilities for cyclists, whereas in other parts of the country where that hasn't happened, there's been much less growth in cycling. Without segregated facilities on London's roads, cycling can be extremely dangerous. The death rate amongst cyclists is terrible because of that. And I'm strongly in favour of cycling. I think it's green, it releases pressure on public transport, it's very healthy for individuals to do, but what we've got to do is to make it safer, and having segregated cycleways is part of that. My experience with Boris Johnson only reinforced my view that we should. And so just to tell you an added story to that, which I haven't told before, on that same journey, we were stopped very dramatically by a motorist who cut across us, Boris Johnson and myself, and stopped us both in his car and jumped out, and he was very agitated. And the reason he jumped out was that I don't know if it was his girlfriend or his wife, had been killed the previous week in a cycling accident with what was also another big problem in London, which was a lorry turning left at a junction, and the bike had ended up going under the wheels of the lorry. And obviously the guy was extremely upset and agitated, and he wanted to tell me and Boris about it and what was happening. And we spent some time with him discussing this issue of cycle safety and how you deal with road junctions. And partly as a result of that encounter, but also work which both Boris Johnson and I set in train, the layout of junctions was changed, and we put new requirements on trucks to have bigger mirrors and left and better signalling when they were turning left at junctions, and also more segregation at junctions so that cyclists can go ahead of the traffic and can pull out before trucks and cars. So this issue of cycle safety and indeed road safety at large is a really, really big and important one here in London and nationally. And it's always important when you're dealing with these issues like Brexit and NHS not to lose sight of the fact that there are a lot of what appear to be more humdrum issues, but actually for most people in the country are every bit as important. I only say all that because you referred to that
thanks for sharing that,
my
actually.
biography, and I won't forget that afternoon.
Yeah. And to end the interview, what would you say your biggest regret in time in government was? Your time in government was? The
Iraq War. I think it was a huge mistake.
Yeah.
And it was a mistake in its own terms. It would be much better not to have invaded Iraq. It would be great if we would have been able to stop George Bush from leading an American invasion, but even if we couldn't stop George Bush, and that was going to be difficult because George Bush was in the grip of hard right American ideologues who were keen to do it, I don't think Britain should have joined in. And if we hadn't joined in that invasion, I think we probably would have had a 4-term Labour government rather than a 3-term Labour government. And we wouldn't be dealing with austerity and Brexit today. So as I look back on it, I think that was a huge mistake, and we're still paying in some ways the price for it today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the interview.
Great to meet you.
Thanks for tuning in.
And all the best with this blog.
Thank you. Done?
It's okay?
We're done.
Now you're going to tell me it wasn't recording.